The invitation had arrived 3 weeks ago, forwarded through the station's internal message system with the particular bureaucratic inevitability of something that had already been sent twice and ignored twice. The third time, it came with a small red flag attached, not a warning exactly, more of an administrative clearing of the throat, and a note from Station Commander Vial indicating that attendance at the quarterly social function was, while technically voluntary, deeply encouraged in the way that only things backed by institutional consequence could be deeply encouraged. Finn Drake had read the note twice, set his coffee down, and spent the following 4 minutes staring at the wall of his quarters with the focused despair of a man contemplating a calculation that kept returning the wrong answer. He went. Of course he went. Kepler Transit Station hung at the outermost reach of the Shaylin corridor like a parenthesis at the end of a sentence no one had finished writing. A long-armed structure of pressurized corridors and rotating habitat rings that housed somewhere between 400 and 430 people, depending on who was currently in transit, and whether you counted the 3 researchers in the lower observatory who had collectively decided that social contact was a hypothesis they'd already disproven. Finn had a certain sympathy for that position. He was an engineer, specifically the kind responsible for the station's atmospheric cycling systems and the 3 subsidiary pressure networks that kept everyone on board breathing at a pressure that could charitably be called comfortable, and he had been at Kepler for 7 months, which was long enough to know where everything was and short enough that he still sometimes ate dinner at off hours to avoid the commissary at capacity. The function was held in the station's largest common space, which was called, with the inspired creativity of institutional naming, Common Space A. It had been decorated for the occasion with bioluminescent filaments strung along the upper curve of the ceiling, borrowed from the xenobotany lab, which cast the entire room in a slow and shifting light that moved between deep amber and something that wasn't quite blue and didn't have a name Finn knew. The effect was genuinely beautiful, which he resented slightly because beauty made departure feel impolite. He signed the attendance log at 1904. His plan was architecture in its simplicity: sign, circulate in a loose perimeter for 20 minutes, refresh an empty glass once to simulate ongoing participation, and exit at 1926 with the satisfied efficiency of a man who had completed an obligation. He had executed this exact sequence at 4 previous functions across 2 postings. It had a success rate of 100%. He saw no structural reason for failure. By 1909, he had a drink he hadn't intended to accept, offered by someone moving past him with a tray, and he was standing near the eastern wall trying to look like a person who was simply pausing between conversations rather than a person who was having none. The room had perhaps 80 people in it, a cross-section of Kepler's population that included human engineers and administrators, a table of Vithani traders whose color-shifting skin made them look like they were perpetually standing in different weather, 3 members of the cartography team who all wore the same expression of mild surprise at being indoors, and a considerably larger number of the station's Shalari residents, whose presence gave the room most of its sound and all of its warmth. The Shalari were humanoid in the way that a sentence could be grammatically correct while still saying something unexpected. They stood like humans, moved like humans, laughed with a cadence Finn's ear had long since stopped finding strange, and they had long, elegant ears that rose to tapered points above the line of their hair, not dramatically, not as a feature demanding acknowledgement, but present and natural as any other architecture of a face. Finn had stopped noticing after his 3rd week aboard, mostly. He was trying to calculate the optimal moment to perform the empty glass maneuver when he became aware, gradually, of a shift in the immediate geometry of his surroundings. It wasn't a sudden thing. It arrived the way pressure changes arrived, imperceptibly until the instrument said otherwise. A small group of women had been nearby for several minutes, their conversation animated and self-contained, and he had registered them the way he registered most things in rooms he was planning to leave, peripherally, without investment. But at some point, and he could not identify the exact point, which would bother him later, the loose arrangement of their positions had begun to describe a shape that included him. He shifted slightly to the left. The conversation redistributed itself naturally, effortlessly, the way water redistributed around an obstacle, and the shape redistributed with it. He was still inside it. He tried the other direction, with the casualness of a man simply adjusting his weight, not a man running navigational calculations on a social situation. Two of the women stepped slightly apart to let someone pass, and then closed again, and the geometry held. Finn looked at his glass. The glass offered no useful engineering data. He identified 6 women in the formation, Shalari, all long-eared and apparently engaged in at least 3 overlapping conversations simultaneously in the way people who had known each other a long time could manage. He recognized 2 of them distantly, the tall one, with silver-threaded hair he'd seen in the upper corridor near the navigation wing, and the younger one, who had once asked him a question in the commissary line that he'd answered incorrectly and thought about twice since. He did not know their names. He knew the shape they were making around him with a specificity that was becoming difficult to ignore. The tall one glanced at him then, not in the way people glanced at strangers by accident. In the way people glanced at a calculation they'd been running for some time and were satisfied was resolving correctly. Finn looked for the gap. There wasn't one. He stood for another 90 seconds with the stillness of a man who had not yet admitted to himself what his legs had already understood. Then, because there was nothing else structurally available to him, because the room had rearranged itself around him with a precision that his own professional life had taught him to recognize as intentional, he sat down on the low bench that happened to be positioned exactly where his knees needed it to be. The tall woman handed him a small dish of something he didn't recognize. "There," she said, with the calm satisfaction of someone completing a long and complicated project on schedule. Finn looked at the dish. He looked at the 6 women now arranged comfortably around him in a circle that felt less like a trap and more, somehow, like a room that had been furnished specifically for this moment. "I want you to know," he said, "that I had a plan." The younger one smiled without looking up from the holographic device in her hand. "We know," she said. "It was a very consistent plan. That's actually why we're here." The dish, it turned out, contained something that tasted like roasted citrus and an argument. Finn ate 3 pieces of it before he could stop himself, and then spent a moment recalibrating his expectations of the evening because a person who was actively enjoying the food had weaker standing to claim they were leaving. The woman with the silver-threaded hair was named Salira. She introduced herself with the particular ease of someone who had been waiting for a conversation to officially begin and was relieved the formality was out of the way. The younger one with the holographic device was Lyra, her sister, who offered her name without looking up, and then immediately showed Finn the screen, as though the introduction and the display were a single continuous gesture. The device was showing a topographical rendering of something Finn couldn't immediately classify. Not a planet surface, not a structure, something in between, with a color gradient that pulsed along its ridgelines in slow intervals. "Navigation model?" Finn asked, because it was the closest category he had. "Contested," Lyra said. "By whom?" "The software, mostly." She tilted the screen slightly. "It keeps insisting this formation is geological. I keep telling it it's not." "What is it?" She looked up at him then, fully, for the first time. She had the direct quality of someone who had grown up in environments where indirectness was an inefficiency no one had time for. "I don't know yet," she said. "That's why I'm arguing with the software. If I already knew, the argument would be over." Finn considered this and found it, reluctantly, reasonable. The third sister was introduced a few minutes later by Salira, with the particular tone of an elder sibling presenting a complicated exhibit. Her name was Nithara, and she had been standing slightly behind Finn's left shoulder for what he now suspected was longer than the introduction implied. She was the middle sister, Salira explained. Nithara corrected this immediately. She was the second sister, she said, which was technically the same thing but carried different implications that she did not elaborate on but clearly felt strongly about. Salira received this correction with the weary patience of someone who had received it many times. Nithara sat down beside Finn with the settled authority of someone taking a position they intended to hold, and said, "You work in atmospheric systems." "I do," Finn said. "You fixed the secondary pressure variance in Corridor 9 last month." "I did. That variance had been producing a sound in the walls of my quarters for 11 months. Finn waited. "Thank you," Nythera said, in a tone that suggested the gratitude had been carefully aged before serving. The other three women in the circle were not sisters, though Finn initially assumed they were because they moved with the coordinated ease of people who had long since stopped negotiating space with each other. Their names settled into him over the following 20 minutes with the gradual accumulation of detail that a new place accrued, not all at once, but persistently, until the absence of the information became harder to maintain than its presence. The room moved around them. Other conversations crossed the edge of the circle and departed. The bioluminescent filaments above shifted toward the color that wasn't quite blue, and the room's collective noise softened by a register Finn's ear noted without his permission. He was aware that he hadn't checked the time in a while. He was aware that this awareness was itself a kind of data point he wasn't sure what to do with. Nythera, it emerged, was the conversational architect of the group in the way that certain people were without knowing it. She asked questions that required complete answers, structured in such a way that silence felt more effortful than participation. She didn't do it aggressively. She did it the way very good systems did their work, which was invisibly, with results that only became apparent once you stepped back far enough to see the pattern. She asked Finn how long the atmospheric cycling on a station this size took to complete a full recalibration. And before he'd finished answering, she'd asked a follow-up that required him to explain why the number was higher than the theoretical minimum. And by the time he'd finished that, he'd been talking for 4 minutes without once feeling like he was talking too much, which was not a sensation he associated with talking to people he'd met 18 minutes ago. "You explained that very clearly," Nythera said. "Thank you," Finn said. "Most people can't explain the things they actually understand," she said. "They can only explain the things they've memorized." Finn was quiet for a moment. "Is that a compliment?" "It was constructed as one," she said. "Whether it landed as one is between you and your interpretation." Across the circle, one of the other women, Ressa, he'd settled on her name by now, made a sound that was almost certainly a suppressed laugh. Finn filed this away. Lyra surfaced from her argument with the navigation software long enough to show him a new iteration of the topographical model, which had evolved during the conversation into something that looked even less geological and more like something else entirely, the category for which Finn was still missing. He studied it with the focused attention of a man who was grateful for a technical problem, because technical problems had correct answers, and correct answers were a form of solid ground. "What's the scale?" he asked. That's part of the problem," Lyra said. "The software keeps changing its assumption about scale, which changes everything downstream. Lock the scale manually and run it again." Lyra looked at him. "You can't lock the scale manually in this modeling environment. That's a base layer parameter. It's not user accessible." "In the standard interface, it isn't," Finn said. "But if you go through the secondary diagnostic menu, there's a parameter override function that the development team left in and then forgot to remove. It's not documented. I found it by accident 8 months ago on a different posting." There was a pause. Lyra looked at the device. Then she looked at Finn. Then she looked at Celira. "We have to keep him," she said. Celira's expression suggested this had already been decided. Finn opened his mouth to say something about not being an object that could be kept, and then closed it again, because the sentence had several structural problems he couldn't resolve quickly enough to deploy it effectively. He took a drink instead. The light above shifted back toward amber. Someone across the room attempted a joke loudly enough that it reached the circle, and the joke was poor, the kind of joke that was too aware of itself to be funny. And Finn, without thinking, said quietly, "The pacing was wrong. You have to commit to the end of it before you get there, or the whole thing collapses." The circle went momentarily quiet. "That," said Nythera, "is also true of most things that are not jokes." Finn considered this. "I meant jokes specifically," he said. "I know," she said. "I broadened it." Ressa stopped suppressing the laugh this time. It turned out she had an excellent laugh, the kind that arrived without apology and made the air in its immediate vicinity more hospitable. Finn found himself doing something with his face that he recognized, after a moment, as the beginning of a smile. He let it happen, mostly because stopping it would have required a level of effort he was no longer certain was worth deploying. The circle held. The evening continued. His glass was refilled by someone before he noticed it was empty, and he did not calculate the time, and the exit vectors for the moment remained unplotted. Somewhere between the second drink and the third, the evening changed texture. It wasn't a dramatic shift. Nothing announced itself. The room simply settled into a later register. The louder conversations finding their natural conclusions, the Vithani traders at their table growing quieter as their skin patterns slowed to the deep, unhurried cycling that Finn had learned meant contentment rather than sleep, though the distinction, a colleague had once told him, was largely philosophical from the outside. The bioluminescent filaments above had found a color and stayed in it, the amber deepening to something warmer and more deliberate, and the common space had contracted in the way large rooms did when they stopped trying to accommodate everyone and started simply holding whoever remained. Finn was still in the circle. He had stopped noticing that he was in the circle, which was itself a thing he noticed briefly, and then set down again because picking it up didn't seem to lead anywhere useful. Nithara had asked him, with the practiced casualness of someone who had been waiting for the right atmospheric conditions, what he did when he wasn't working. Finn had answered honestly, which was that he read technical documentation for systems adjacent to his specialization, ran diagnostic simulations he wasn't strictly required to run, and occasionally ate dinner while watching recorded footage of weather systems on planets he'd never been to and probably wouldn't visit. He delivered this information in the tone of a man reporting facts, which it was, and registered only afterward, from the quality of the silence that followed, that it had landed as something more like a confession. Weather systems, Salira said, not as a question. Large-scale atmospheric behavior, Finn said, which he recognized immediately was not an improvement. On planets you haven't been to, Nithara said. It's relaxing, Finn said. The scale makes everything else feel appropriately sized. Lyra looked up from the device. That's the saddest thing I've heard this quarter, she said, with the tone of someone delivering a geological survey result. Not cruel, simply accurate. The quarter isn't over, Ressa offered helpfully. It's a high bar, Lyra agreed. Finn looked at his glass. I want to register that I don't experience it as sad, he said. I experience it as calibrating. Calibrating, Nithara repeated, in the voice of someone writing the word down somewhere internal for later examination. To scale, Finn added, which he was aware was not helping his position. What happened next happened in the way that certain true things happened, not because anyone decided to say them, but because the room had arrived at a temperature where they could exist without burning. Finn set his glass down on the low surface beside him, and he looked at no one in particular, and he said that the reason he didn't come to these functions, the actual reason, underneath the engineering of it, underneath the exit vectors and the attendance log timing, was that he was never sure what he was supposed to contribute. That conversations at functions like this operated on a set of social parameters he understood theoretically but couldn't execute reliably, the way he understood the mathematics of certain fluid dynamics problems that he couldn't solve quickly enough in practice to be useful. That it felt, consistently, like arriving at a system without the documentation and running it anyway, and waiting for the part where something failed. The circle received this without reorganizing itself around it. No one moved with the careful, managed sympathy that would have made him wish he'd said something else. Salira was quiet for a moment in a way that felt like thinking rather than the performance of thinking. And then she said that she had found his personnel file 3 months ago by accident while cross-referencing engineering shift schedules with habitat assignment data, and that his record of declined social invitations was so consistent across postings that the station's social coordination system had quietly reclassified him from inactive to structurally absent, which was a category she hadn't known existed until his file introduced her to it. There's a category, Finn said. There are 17 people in it on this station alone, Salira said. You were ranked 4th by consistency. 4th, Finn said. You had a strong record, she said, but the 3 above you had seniority. Finn absorbed this. I don't know whether to be relieved or competitive, he said. Both responses are valid, Nithara said, though I'd recommend against optimizing for the category. Ressa laughed again, and the laugh did what it always did, which was make the immediate air more livable, and Finn let it settle around him without deflecting it. It was Lyra, still nominally attending to her device, but with the distracted quality of someone listening more carefully than they appeared to, who said the thing that opened the next room of the conversation. She said it without ceremony, directed at the topographical model on her screen, rather than at Finn, which somehow made it easier to hear. She said that her first posting had been a research station in the outer Delhari system, small enough that the entire crew fit in a single corridor if they stood close, and that for the first 4 months, she had been so uncertain of her place in the existing social geometry of the crew that she had developed 17 different plausible reasons to leave any room within 90 seconds of entering it. She had timed herself. She had a spreadsheet. A spreadsheet, Finn said. Color-coded, she said. By excuse category. That's... He stopped. Extremely relatable? Nythera suggested. I was going to say thorough, Finn said. It was both, Lyra said, and something in her voice had shifted just enough that thorough and relatable were no longer opposites. The circle was quiet for a moment in the good way, the way that silences were quiet when they were doing something rather than waiting for something. Nythera set her own glass down with a precision that was not quite deliberate enough to be theatrical, and said that they had surrounded him, and she used the word plainly, without apology, because it was accurate, and accuracy was a form of respect, because leaving him alone had started to feel like a decision they were making on his behalf, that every function he didn't come to, they had not actively tried to change, which meant they had passively permitted it, which meant the permission was a kind of choice, and at a certain point a choice made repeatedly becomes a position, and none of them had agreed to hold that position consciously. So they had decided to stop holding it, and the most reliable way to stop holding it was to make leaving structurally inconvenient. Finn turned this over with the focused attention he gave to components he didn't have schematics for. You engineered a social trap, he said, on the grounds that it was more ethical than continued inaction. We prefer intervention, Lyra said. With good catering, Ressa added. The catering was essential, Lyra confirmed, still looking at her screen. You ate the citrus dish. That was load-bearing. Finn thought about the citrus dish. He thought about the 3 pieces he'd eaten before he could stop himself, and how stopping himself had not ultimately occurred. The catering was good, he admitted. We know your commissary preferences, Nythera said, in a tone that closed a door on further inquiry on that subject. Finn decided not to open it. Some schematics, he was learning, were provided on a need-to-know basis, and the evening had already given him more than he'd budgeted for. He picked his glass back up. The amber light held steady above them. Outside the long viewports along the eastern wall, the stars maintained their fixed and total indifference, and inside the circle, Finn Drake sat with the strange and unfamiliar weight of having said a true thing to people who had not flinched at it. He wasn't sure yet what to do with that, but he didn't calculate the distance to the door, and that, for now, was something. The room had thinned to perhaps 20 people by the time Lyra solved the scale problem. She didn't announce it. She made a sound that was somewhere between a breath and a word, the kind of sound a person made when something they'd been holding at arm's length finally arrived at the correct distance, and then she held the device out toward Finn with the quiet authority of someone presenting evidence. He leaned over. The topographical model had resolved into something that was no longer contested. The ridgelines sat cleanly at their correct elevation. The color gradient had stabilized into a coherent sequence, and the formation that the software had been insisting was geological was now unmistakably not. Atmospheric deposit, Finn said. Atmospheric deposit, Lyra confirmed. On what kind of surface? That, she said, is the next argument. Finn looked at the model for another moment. If the substrate is porous, the deposit pattern would follow the pressure differential from the prevailing wind direction. You could back-calculate the wind history from the formation shape. He paused. I could write you the calculation framework if you want. It's not complicated, it's just specific. Lyra looked at him with an expression he was starting to recognize as her version of warmth, which presented differently than most people's warmth, but was no less genuine for the difference. Yes, she said. I want that. We're keeping him, she said again to Lyra with additional conviction. You've said that twice now, Finn said. The second time was for emphasis, she said. In my field, we repeat measurements to confirm they're real. Celera, from across the circle, which had contracted over the course of the evening from a formation of strategic containment into something that simply felt like a place where people were sitting, made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite agreement but contained elements of both. The remaining women had settled into the comfortable arrangement of people who had stopped performing the evening and were simply inside it. Ressa was in conversation with one of the cartography team members who had drifted into the circle's orbit sometime in the last hour, the pair of them deep in a disagreement about transit corridor mapping that had the energetic quality of a dispute both parties were enjoying. Nithera had acquired a second dish of the citrus thing from somewhere and set it between herself and Finn without comment, which Finn understood by now to be her primary dialect of generosity. He took a piece. Of course he took a piece. The station's environmental systems, his own systems, had shifted the atmospheric composition of Common Space A by a small but perceptible margin as the hour advanced, a standard protocol for late evening occupation levels, reducing the nitrogen balance slightly to encourage the particular quality of relaxation that made people feel the day had been completed rather than merely survived. Finn knew the exact parameters. He had written 2 of the subroutines involved. Sitting inside the effect of his own work without having planned to was strange in a way he found he didn't mind. It was Nithera who returned, eventually, to the thing he'd said earlier, not abruptly, not with the pointed intent of someone circling back to an unfinished argument, but in the way a river returned to a particular bank, because the current had always been moving that way. She said that she'd been thinking about what he'd described. The documentation problem, arriving at a system without the parameters and running it anyway. She said she thought he'd been solving the wrong problem, or rather solving the right problem with the wrong assumption embedded in it, which in engineering terms she understood to be a specific and correctable type of error. Finn looked at her. What's the wrong assumption? That the documentation exists, she said, and you simply haven't been given it. In most social systems, there isn't documentation. Everyone is running the system without parameters. The people who appear to know what they're doing have simply made their peace with not knowing. She picked up her glass. You've been treating a universal condition as a personal deficiency. The circle was quiet. That's, Finn started, and stopped, and started again. That's either very reassuring or a significant indictment of social systems in general. Yes, Nithera said. Which one? I believe I said either, she said pleasantly. Ressa surfaced briefly from the mapping dispute to say, without context, both, obviously, and then returned to it. Finn sat with this. Outside the viewports, the Shaylin corridor stretched in the specific darkness that existed between mapped points, the stars present but unhelpful in the way stars reliably were, beautiful and distant and completely uninterested in anyone's navigational uncertainty. He had looked at stars from viewports on 4 different postings, and he had always found them clarifying in a way he couldn't articulate precisely, which was unusual for him. He thought it was the scale of it, the way they made the specific problem in front of you correctly sized. He said, without fully planning to, that he thought the surrounding had worked. Celera tilted her head by a fraction that meant she was listening with more attention than her posture suggested. Not just tonight, Finn said. The mechanism of it, preventing the exit. I'd been treating the exit as the solution and the room as the problem, and I'd had that inverted for, I think, longer than just this posting. He looked at the citrus dish. A well-constructed intervention is just a constraint applied in the right location, he said. In systems terms, you put the constraint where the failure mode is and the system corrects. We're going to need you to say that without the engineering framing, Lyra said, so that it sounds like an emotion and not a maintenance report. I appreciated being surrounded, Finn said, by people who thought my presence was worth the effort of containing. The silence this time was the best kind, the kind that arrived when something had been said correctly and the room knew it and no one wanted to put furniture in front of it. Celera said, quietly, You were never difficult to want around, Finn. You were only difficult to locate. The evening ended without a clear border, the way good evenings did, dissolving at the edges rather than concluding at a point. People drifted. The cartography team member shook Ressa's hand with the warmth of a resolved argument. Lyra saved 3 versions of the atmospheric deposit model and then looked at Finn and said she expected the calculation framework by end of next shift, in the tone of someone issuing a work order, which he found he didn't mind at all. He walked back through the station's corridors at a late hour, the lighting reduced to its night cycle amber, the atmospheric hum of his own system steady and familiar in the walls around him. He passed Corridor 9, where the pressure variance had been, where Nethera's walls had hummed for 11 months before he'd fixed them. He stopped there for a moment, not for any specific reason, simply because it was a place where he had solved something, and it seemed worth acknowledging. He continued on. At the long viewport near the junction of Habitation Ring 2 and the central spoke, he stopped again. The stars were exactly where they always were. The Shaylin corridor extended beyond the edge of the station's lights into the darkness that maps described but didn't explain. He looked at it for a moment and did not feel the particular smallness he sometimes felt at viewports, the one that had always seemed like honesty, but might, he now considered, have been something he'd simply grown accustomed to calling that. He thought about the circle, about Lyra's spreadsheet, color-coded by excuse category, about Nethera's 11 months of wall hum and the particular texture of her gratitude when she'd finally named it, about Celira handing him the drink before the evening had officially begun, with the calm of someone completing a project on schedule, about the citrus dish, about being located. He had a calculation framework to write by end of next shift. He turned from the viewport and walked toward his quarters, and the corridor was the same corridor it had always been. The same pressurized length of a station he'd been living inside for 7 months. And it was also, in some way he didn't have precise language for yet, but thought he might find eventually, somewhere, he lived.